sometimes the ones the world leaves behind are the very ones carrying a truth no one else was meant to find. The rain had been falling since late afternoon. A slow grey curtain drifting across the hills outside Cedar Hollow, Michigan. By evening, the parking lot of the County Canine Retirement Center glistened beneath rows of amber streetlights, each reflection trembling across the wet pavement like scattered pieces of memory. Families came and went throughout the day, smiling as they met retired service dogs searching for new homes. On Buwan, the kennels emptied. Excited barks echoed through the building, followed by the sound of car doors closing and engines disappearing into the distance. By 7 o'clock, only one dog remained. His name was Ranger. He lay quietly in the last kennel at the end of the hallway, his large body curled against a folded blanket worn thin by years of use. At 9 years old, Ranger no longer carried the sharp, restless energy that had once made him one of the most respected canine officers in the state. Silver fur traced the edges of his muzzle. Tiny scars hid beneath the dark grey and black coat that still carried hints of strength beneath age. His amber eyes followed each passing shadow with calm patience, as though he had learned long ago that waiting was simply part of life. Earlier that afternoon, 3 different families had stopped in front of his kennel. They smiled politely. They read the information card clipped beside the gate. Then they moved on. Some preferred younger dogs. Others worried about medical expenses. One couple simply said they wanted a pet that could grow with their children. Ranger never barked, never begged, never pressed his paws against the gate. He only watched them leave. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the distant hills. The shelter manager switched off several lights and sighed as she reviewed paperwork at the front desk. Another adoption event was ending. Another day had passed without anyone choosing Ranger. The old German shepherd lifted his head when he heard footsteps entering through the main doors. Not excited footsteps, not hurried footsteps, just slow, steady ones. The kind belonging to someone carrying more thoughts than plans. Officer Caleb Morgan stepped inside, brushing rainwater from the shoulders of his dark canvas jacket. At 42 years old, Caleb had spent nearly half his life serving the people of Cedar Hollow. His broad frame still reflected years of training, but his posture carried the quiet weight of someone who had learned that not every burden could be left behind at the end of a shift. Raindrops clung to his short, dark brown hair, streaked faintly with silver near the temples. His grey-blue eyes moved across the nearly empty facility with polite curiosity. He had not come to adopt a dog. In fact, he had no intention of staying more than a few minutes. A routine inspection had brought him there after a report regarding storm drainage behind the property. That was all, or at least that was what he believed. The shelter manager greeted him warmly and pointed him toward the rear exit where maintenance records were stored. Caleb nodded and started down the long hallway. As he passed the empty kennels, silence followed him. Then he reached the final enclosure. Ranger slowly rose to his feet. For several seconds, neither moved. The dog simply stood there beneath the soft yellow light, watching him with an expression so calm and focused that Caleb instinctively stopped walking. Something about those eyes felt familiar. Not because he recognized the dog, because he recognized the feeling of being overlooked, of waiting longer than anyone expected. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere far away, thunder murmured again. Ranger stepped closer to the gate. Not excited, Not desperate, just deliberate. Then he lowered his head slightly and pressed his nose against the chain-link fence. Caleb frowned gently. "Hey there, buddy," he said. The German shepherd never barked. He simply looked up at him as if he had been waiting all evening for one specific person to walk through that door. Caleb stood there longer than he intended. The shelter manager called down the hallway, asking if everything was all right. But he barely heard her. Ranger had not moved away from the gate. His amber eyes remained fixed on Caleb with an intensity that felt strangely human. Not demanding, not pleading, simply waiting. Caleb finally stepped closer. The old German shepherd lowered his head slightly and gave a slow wag of his tail. It was the first sign of emotion the shelter manager had seen from him all day. "That is unusual," she said as she approached. "He has barely reacted to anyone since the event started this morning." Caleb glanced toward her. "How long has he been retired?" "Almost a year." Her voice softened. "He served with the State Police Canine Unit for 7 years. Excellent record. Search work. Tracking. Missing persons. Everyone respected him." Rain tapped steadily against the roof overhead. Ranger remained still as Caleb crouched near the gate. Up close, he could see the silver spreading across the dog's muzzle and the faint cloudiness beginning to touch the edges of his eyes. Time had found him, just as it found everyone eventually. Yet something beneath that age remained strong. Something unbroken. Caleb reached through the fence and rested a hand near the dog's shoulder. Ranger did not flinch. Instead, he leaned forward ever so slightly. As though recognizing a familiar language, neither of them needed words to speak. The shelter manager smiled sadly. "Most people want a younger dog. Easier years ahead. Fewer vet bills. They see his age before they see who he is." Caleb nodded without answering. He understood that feeling better than he cared to admit. His gaze drifted downward toward the worn leather collar, resting against Ranger's thick fur. The leather looked older than the dog himself, darkened by rain, sunlight, and years of service. It carried tiny cracks along the edges. It was not standard department equipment. It looked personal, almost handmade. Ranger suddenly shifted closer to the gate. His movement drew Caleb's attention back to the collar. A small brass buckle reflected the overhead light. Beneath it, partially hidden by folded leather, something caught his eye. Tiny markings, faded lettering. Caleb narrowed his eyes. "Has anyone ever looked at this collar closely?" The shelter manager shook her head. "It came with him from storage. We kept it because he seemed attached to it." Caleb reached carefully through the gate and lifted part of the leather. Ranger remained completely still. Outside, a distant roll of thunder drifted across the valley. The building seemed quieter than before, almost as if the storm itself were listening. The markings were nearly impossible to read. Years of wear had softened the engraving until only fragments remained visible beneath the dim hallway lights. Caleb adjusted the angle and squinted. One word emerged. Then another. His pulse slowed. Not from fear, from recognition. The sensation that sometimes arrived before an important memory surfaced. Ranger watched him closely. The old dog's ears lifted slightly. Caleb leaned nearer. Water dripped from his jacket onto the concrete floor. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he gently brushed his thumb across the hidden inscription. Beneath the worn leather, a sentence slowly revealed itself. The letters were faded, but still there, waiting, preserved through years of silence. And as Caleb read the first few words, something changed in Ranger's expression. The dog stood a little taller, not because he was excited, because for the first time in a very long time, someone had finally begun to notice what he had been carrying all along. The hallway seemed to shrink around them as Caleb stared at the faded inscription. For a moment he wondered if he had read it incorrectly. Years of wear had erased portions of the message, but the remaining words were unmistakable. If I do not come back, let Ranger show the truth. Beneath the sentence was a name that pulled him backward through time, like the sudden scent of rain on an old battlefield. Daniel Walker. Caleb slowly lowered the collar. The sound of the storm faded beneath the rush of memory. Daniel had been one of the finest officers he had ever known. Calm under pressure. Honest to a fault. The kind of man who remembered birthdays, brought coffee to dispatchers, working late shifts, and stopped to help stranded drivers even when his shift had already ended. 7 years earlier, the department had announced that Daniel had died during an operation outside the county. The details had always been limited. Official, clean, closed. Caleb had accepted it because there had been nothing else to do. Yet now, Daniel's name rested beneath his fingertips, hidden inside a collar no one had bothered to examine. Ranger stepped closer. His tail moved once against the concrete floor. Not excitement. Recognition. Caleb swallowed slowly. Daniel Walker. He whispered. The instant the name left his mouth, Ranger reacted. The old German shepherd lifted his head and released a low breath through his nose. His ears rose sharply. Every muscle in his body seemed suddenly alert. The shelter manager noticed it too. That is the most responsive he has been in months, she said quietly. Caleb never took his eyes off the dog. You know that name? Ranger stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, he turned toward the kennel door. He looked back once. Then, toward the door again, Caleb felt a strange chill despite the warmth inside the building. Outside, rain streamed down the windows in silver ribbons. Beyond the glass, darkness covered the parking lot. Ranger paced 2 steps toward the gate and stopped, waiting. Caleb had seen behavior like that before. Search dogs used it when they wanted handlers to follow. The shelter manager unlocked the kennel. Be careful, she said, though her voice carried more curiosity than concern. The gate swung open with a soft metallic click. Ranger walked out immediately. Not toward freedom. Not toward the exit. Toward Caleb. The old dog stopped beside him and gently pressed his shoulder against his leg. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Ranger began walking down the hallway. Halfway to the front entrance, he paused and looked back. Caleb followed. Something deep inside him, something he had not felt in years, told him this moment mattered. Rain greeted them. The instant the door opened, cool air drifted into the lobby, carrying the scent of wet pine and distant cedar. Ranger stepped outside and stood beneath the awning. He scanned the parking lot with focused attention before turning toward a weathered pickup truck parked near the edge of the property. Caleb frowned. It was his truck. Ranger walked directly toward it. The old German shepherd stopped beside the passenger door and sat down. Water beaded across his silvered fur. His amber eyes never left Caleb. Then he lifted one paw and touched the door. Almost deliberately, as if asking a question he had waited years for someone to answer. Caleb stood beneath the awning while rain drummed softly across the metal roof. Water flowed along the edges of the parking lot in thin silver streams, gathering beneath the glow of the streetlights before disappearing into the darkness beyond. Ranger remained seated beside the passenger door of the truck, his paw resting lightly against the weathered paint. The old dog did not bark. He did not whine. He simply waited. Caleb approached slowly. "You want to go somewhere?" he asked. Ranger's ears lifted. The German Shepherd rose immediately and touched the door again. The response was so direct that Caleb felt an unexpected smile tug at the corner of his mouth. It had been a long time since anything surprised him. The shelter manager stepped outside, carrying a folder protected beneath a clear plastic cover. Rain misted around her as she crossed the pavement. "If you are taking him," she said softly, "these are his records." Caleb glanced down at the folder. Medical reports, training certifications, retirement paperwork, years of service reduced to a stack of pages. He accepted it and looked back toward Ranger. The old dog was already watching him, waiting for a decision that somehow felt much larger than adopting a retired K9. 10 minutes later, the truck rolled out of the shelter parking lot. Rain swept across the windshield in steady waves while the wipers moved back and forth with mechanical rhythm. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat as though he had occupied that position his entire life. His posture remained alert despite the late hour. Cedar Hollow drifted past outside in shades of gold and gray. Small storefronts stood quiet beneath the storm. Porch lights glowed warmly through curtains. Wind stirred the branches of maple trees lining the streets. Caleb drove without speaking. Ranger stared ahead. Yet the silence between them felt strangely comfortable. Halfway through town, Caleb noticed movement. Ranger had shifted toward the window. His ears stood tall. His body had become rigid with concentration. "What is it?" Caleb asked. The dog focused on something ahead. A moment later, Caleb saw it. An old bronze street sign standing at the edge of an intersection. Walker Avenue. The name struck him immediately. Daniel Walker. Ranger released a low breath and fixed his gaze on the sign until the truck passed beneath it. Then he turned and looked directly at Caleb. The officer tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Coincidence. He told himself. Just a street name. Nothing more. Yet Ranger continued watching him. Rain tapped softly against the glass. The farther they drove, the stronger the feeling became that the dog was not reacting randomly. Eventually, Caleb turned onto the narrow road leading toward his small cabin on the northern edge of town. Pines crowded both sides of the pavement. Their dark silhouettes swayed gently beneath the storm clouds. Ranger suddenly stood up. His nose pressed toward the windshield. Ahead, nearly hidden between rows of trees, stood an abandoned railway station. The structure had not been used in years. Weathered wood covered the walls. Broken lamps hung above a platform overtaken by grass and wildflowers. Caleb rarely thought about the place anymore. Ranger began breathing faster. Not from fear, from anticipation. As the truck approached the station entrance, the German Shepherd let out a single sharp bark, then another, then a third. Caleb's pulse quickened. He had not heard the dog bark until now. The three deliberate sounds echoed through the cab before disappearing into the rain. Ranger turned toward the station and stared into the darkness beyond the platform. Something was there. Or perhaps something had been waiting there all along. Caleb slowed the truck until it rolled to a stop along the shoulder. Rain drifted through the beams of the headlights like silver threads descending from the darkness above. The abandoned station stood motionless beyond the windshield. Once, decades earlier, trains had carried families, workers, and travelers through Cedar Hollow. Now only wind visited the platform. Ranger remained fixed on the structure. His amber eyes reflected the pale glow of the dashboard. Then, without hesitation, he nudged the passenger door with his nose. Caleb exhaled slowly. "All right," he murmured. "Let us see what has your attention." The moment the door opened, Ranger stepped into the rain. Not quickly, not recklessly, with purpose. Caleb grabbed a flashlight from the center console and followed. Wet gravel crunched beneath his boots as they crossed toward the station. Water dripped from the sagging roofline. Old wooden beams groaned softly whenever the wind shifted through them. Ranger moved ahead, his nose low, occasionally pausing as though confirming a trail invisible to everyone else. The station smelled of damp timber, rust, and earth. Time lingered there like a quiet ghost. Caleb swept his flashlight across the platform. Faded benches sat beneath layers of dust. A cracked timetable still hung crookedly on one wall. Frozen years in the past. Nothing appeared unusual, yet Ranger continued forward. The dog climbed 3 weathered steps leading into the main waiting room. His paws echoed softly against the wooden floor. Caleb followed. Rain tapped against broken windows. Shadows stretched across the room. Ranger stopped near the far corner where an old ticket counter stood beneath a row of dark windows. He sniffed carefully along the floorboards. Then he looked at Caleb. 1 step forward, 1 glance back. The same signal again. "Follow me." Caleb felt the strange sensation return. The feeling that events were moving according to a pattern he could not yet see. Ranger scratched lightly at the floor. Once, twice. Then he stepped aside. Caleb lowered the flashlight. The boards looked ordinary at first. Aged, worn, forgotten. But one plank carried a narrow gap along its edge, almost invisible unless someone knew where to look. Kneeling carefully, Caleb ran his fingers across the wood. The board shifted. His heartbeat quickened. Ranger watched silently. Caleb worked the plank loose and lifted it. Beneath lay a small metal container wrapped in oilcloth. The package was protected from moisture despite the years. For several moments, he simply stared. Rain whispered against the roof overhead. Somewhere beyond the station. Thunder rolled across the hills. Caleb carefully removed the container and opened it. Inside rested a single photograph sealed within a plastic sleeve. He aimed the flashlight downward. The image showed 2 men standing beside a patrol vehicle beneath bright summer sunlight. One was younger, Caleb. The other was Daniel Walker. Caleb froze. Memories rushed forward with startling clarity. The photograph had been taken nearly a decade earlier during a community event downtown. He remembered the day. He remembered the laughter. He remembered Daniel standing exactly as he appeared now. Smiling toward the camera, Caleb turned the photograph over. Written neatly on the back were 4 words that sent a chill through the quiet station. Trust Ranger. Follow the map. Beneath the message, folded carefully into a square no larger than a wallet, rested a yellowed piece of paper. Ranger stepped closer and lowered his head beside Caleb's shoulder, as though the years between them and Daniel Walker had suddenly become much shorter. Caleb carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. The edges crackled softly beneath his fingers. preserved by years of protection inside the metal container. Ranger remained beside him. His warm shoulder pressed lightly against Caleb's arm as rain whispered against the roof above. The flashlight beam illuminated, a hand-drawn map sketched in dark blue ink. Time had faded portions of it, but several landmarks remained clear. Cedar Creek, Pine Ridge Road, Old Miller Bridge. Caleb recognized every location. They were all places within 15 miles of town. Across the bottom of the map, Daniel's handwriting appeared once more. If you are reading this, trust Ranger. He knows the way. Caleb stared at the words. For a long moment, the station seemed suspended outside of time. Daniel's voice almost returned through the memory of the handwriting. Calme, précis, certain. Ranger suddenly nudged the map with his nose. Then he turned toward the doorway. The old dog's tail remained still, but his eyes carried unmistakable focus. He wanted to continue. Caleb folded the map carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Together, they left the abandoned station and stepped back into the rain. The storm had softened now. Clouds drifted slowly across the night sky, revealing occasional patches of moonlight above the dark pines. Back inside the truck, Caleb spread the map across the passenger seat while Ranger watched. One location stood out immediately. Old Miller Bridge, a forgotten wooden crossing over Cedar Creek nearly 12 miles north of town. The bridge had been closed for years after flooding damaged part of the structure. Few people visited anymore. Caleb started the engine. The truck rolled through the sleeping town before turning onto the narrow county road leading north. Ranger remained alert the entire drive. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the map, then back toward the road ahead. The farther they traveled, the stronger Caleb's feeling became that this journey had begun long before tonight. Moonlight filtered through thinning clouds as they finally reached the bridge. The creek below shimmered like liquid silver between rows of towering pines. Water flowed steadily over smooth stones, carrying the gentle sound of movement through the stillness. Caleb parked beside the old access road and stepped out. Cool air carried the scent of wet earth and cedar needles. Ranger immediately headed toward the bridge. Not across it. Beneath it, Caleb followed carefully along a narrow path leading down the embankment. Ferns brushed against his boots. The creek murmured beside them. Ranger moved with surprising confidence for a dog his age. Near one of the bridge supports, he stopped. The old German shepherd lowered his head and began sniffing the ground around a cluster of moss-covered stones. Then he sat down. Caleb swept the flashlight beam across the area. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then a faint reflection caught his eye beneath the moss. He knelt and brushed away years of growth. A small metal marker emerged from the stone, bolted securely into place. Deliberately hidden. His pulse quickened. Engraved into the weathered metal were two initials, D.W. Daniel Walker. Beneath the initials was an arrow pointing toward the opposite bank of the creek. Caleb slowly looked up. Across the water, barely visible through the trees, stood a small cabin tucked deep within the forest. No lights, no signs of recent activity. Just a silent structure waiting beneath the moonlit pines. Ranger stood and fixed his gaze on the cabin. Then he looked back at Caleb, the same look he had given him at the shelter. Patient, certain, as though every step of the path had been leading here. The creek flowed quietly between the banks as Caleb stood motionless beneath the moonlit trees. Across the water, the cabin seemed almost unreal. hidden among towering pines that had likely watched over it for decades. A thin layer of mist drifted through the forest, wrapping the trunks in pale silver shadows. Ranger was already moving. The old German shepherd stepped carefully across a line of exposed stones near the creek's edge and climbed toward the opposite bank. Caleb followed. Cold water splashed against his boots, but he barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the cabin. Every clue had led here. Every mile, every hidden message, every year of silence. The structure itself was small. Built from cedar logs darkened by time and weather, moss covered portions of the roof. Wildflowers grew beside the front porch. Despite the late season, nothing about the place suggested abandonment. Instead, it felt preserved, protected, waiting. Ranger climbed the porch steps and stopped beside the front door. His tail remained still. His breathing was calm. He looked back at Caleb. Then toward the door. The same signal again. Caleb stepped forward and reached for the handle. To his surprise, it turned easily. The door opened with a soft creak. A faint scent of cedar and old paper drifted into the night air. Inside, moonlight filtered through narrow windows. Dust floated gently through the pale beams, like tiny drifting stars. The cabin was simple but carefully maintained. A stone fireplace stood against one wall. Shelves lined with books occupied another. A wooden table sat near the center of the room. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared forgotten. Caleb slowly entered. Ranger walked directly toward the fireplace. There, mounted above the mantel, hung a framed photograph. Caleb raised his flashlight. His breath caught. The picture showed Daniel Walker standing beside Ranger years earlier. The dog looked younger, stronger, his coat darker. Daniel knelt beside him, with one hand resting on the shepherd's shoulder. Both seemed to be looking directly into the camera, smiling. Caleb stared at the image for several moments. Then he noticed something else. Tucked behind the frame was a folded envelope. His name was written across the front. Caleb Morgan. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Daniel. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside rested several pages and a small brass key. Moonlight illuminated the first lines of the letter. If you are reading this, Caleb, then Ranger found you. I always believed he would. Caleb lowered himself into a nearby chair. The cabin fell silent, except for the faint rustle of wind outside. Ranger lay down beside his feet as though his task had finally reached an important milestone. Caleb continued reading. Daniel explained that years earlier he had uncovered information that troubled him deeply. Not evidence of violence, not danger. Something quieter. Financial records, property transfers, and missing documents connected to land surrounding Cedar Hollow. Valuable land. Land that had quietly changed ownership through means that never seemed quite right. Daniel had spent years gathering records, following trails, asking questions. Then, sensing that he might never complete the investigation himself, he created a series of clues only one partner could follow. Ranger. Caleb turned another page. Maps, notes, dates, names. Years of careful work lay hidden inside the envelope. Then he reached the final sheet. Across the bottom, Daniel had written a single sentence. The truth is not buried here. This is only where the path begins. Ranger lifted his head at that exact moment and looked toward a closed door at the rear of the cabin. as though even now there was still more waiting to be discovered. Caleb followed Ranger's gaze toward the closed door at the rear of the cabin. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines, carrying the scent of cedar and distant rain. The forest seemed quieter than before, as though every tree were listening. He rose from the chair, folded Daniel's letter carefully, and slipped it back into the envelope. The brass key rested cold and heavy in his palm. Ranger stood immediately. Despite the long night, despite his age, the old German shepherd showed no sign of fatigue. Purpose seemed to carry him forward. Caleb crossed the cabin floor and stopped before the door. The lock was old brass, darkened by years. The key slid in smoothly. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he turned it. A soft click echoed through the room. The door opened inward. The beam of his flashlight swept across a narrow staircase descending beneath the cabin. Stone walls appeared from the darkness. Dust drifted through the light. Ranger stepped onto the first stair without hesitation. Caleb followed. The air below felt cool and dry. Each step carried them deeper beneath the forest floor. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a surprisingly large underground room. Shelves lined the walls. Filing cabinets stood in neat rows. Maps covered a long wooden table. Everything had been organized with meticulous care. It looked less like a hiding place and more like a private archive. Caleb slowly turned in a circle. Daniel had built this piece by piece, year after year. One entire wall displayed property maps of Cedar Hollow and the surrounding county. Colored pins marked dozens of locations. Beside them hung copies of deeds, survey reports, and handwritten notes. Caleb approached the nearest table. What he found there made him stop. The missing land records Daniel had mentioned were not missing at all. They had been preserved. Every document had been copied and catalogued. Ranch, forest parcels, lakeside properties, old family farms. The patterns slowly emerged. Over several decades, valuable land had quietly been transferred away from elderly owners who had no surviving relatives. The properties had eventually been consolidated into a network of holding companies controlled by the same small group of investors. Yet Daniel's notes revealed something even more important. Most of the original owners had never intended to give up their land. Many had believed the property would eventually benefit local charities, veterans programs, or community trusts. Their wishes had simply been lost beneath layers of paperwork. Caleb felt his chest tighten, not from anger, from sadness. Years of hopes and promises had disappeared into silence. Ranger moved toward a cabinet near the back wall. He nudged it gently with his nose. Caleb opened the drawer. Inside rested a stack of sealed envelopes. Each carried a name. Local families, former residents, people Caleb recognized. Beneath the envelopes lay one final folder marked in Daniel's handwriting. For Emily. Caleb opened it carefully. The folder contained photographs, letters, and one final message. Daniel had spent years protecting evidence, but he had never wanted revenge or recognition. He had wanted restoration. He wanted the truth returned to the families who deserved it. He wanted forgotten promises honored. Most of all, he wanted Emily to know that he had never stopped believing goodness would eventually prevail. Caleb lowered the folder. Ranger sat beside him in silence. The old dog's amber eyes reflected the flashlight beam. For the first time that night, Caleb fully understood why Daniel had trusted him. This was never about exposing a scandal. It was about bringing lost things home, and somewhere beyond the walls of that hidden room. Dawn was beginning to approach. Morning arrived quietly over Cedar Hollow. Pale sunlight filtered through the pines surrounding the cabin, turning droplets of rain into tiny crystals of gold. For the first time in many years, Caleb felt no urgency to leave. The hidden room beneath the cabin no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a promise finally being fulfilled. Over the following weeks, the documents Daniel had preserved were carefully reviewed and delivered to the people they belonged to. Families received letters they never knew existed. Community organizations discovered property rights that had been intended for public benefit. Old questions that had lingered for decades finally found answers. The process was slow, respectful, and honest, exactly as Daniel would have wanted. Through it all, Ranger remained at Caleb's side. The old German shepherd seemed different now, lighter somehow, as though the burden he had carried for so many years had finally begun to lift. Every morning, they walked together through town. People who once passed the retired K9 without a second glance now stopped to greet him. Children offered gentle pats on his silvered head. Shop owners kept treats behind their counters. Ranger accepted the attention with quiet dignity. One afternoon, Caleb drove to a small white house near the edge of town. Emily Walker opened the door before he could knock. Time had softened the grief in her eyes, but it had never completely disappeared. When she saw Ranger standing beside him, her hand rose slowly to her mouth. The old dog stepped forward and rested his head gently against her arm. For several seconds, no one spoke. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she knelt beside him. She whispered Daniel's name. Ranger closed his eyes. Caleb handed her the folder and the final letter Daniel had written. They spent hours together that afternoon, sharing stories, photographs, and memories. Sunlight drifted across the room while years of unanswered questions finally settled into peace. Before Caleb left, Emily smiled through her tears and placed a hand on Ranger's shoulder. He kept his promise, she said softly. Caleb looked down at the old shepherd. Yes, he replied. He really did. Autumn arrived a few months later. Golden leaves covered the hills surrounding Cedar Hollow. One evening, Caleb sat on the porch of his cabin watching the sunset spread across the valley in shades of amber and crimson. Ranger lay beside him, resting comfortably beneath a wool blanket. The old dog's breathing was slow and peaceful. A cool breeze moved through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, church bells drifted across the town. Caleb reached down and gently touched the worn leather collar that had started everything. The faded inscription remained hidden inside. The message had never been meant for everyone, only for the person willing to notice. Ranger lifted his head and looked toward the horizon. Caleb followed his gaze. The valley glowed beneath the fading light. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the old German shepherd rested his head against Caleb's knee, and as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills, it felt as though one faithful dog had finally completed the journey he had been waiting years to finish.